Kia ora koutou. Thanks Engineering New Zealand for hosting us, and welcome everybody from the Transportation Group. Ko Ngāti Pākehā toku iwi, no Kirikiri rā aho, ko Doran toku whānau, ko Bridget Burdett toku ingoa. I am the chair of Engineering New Zealand's Transportation Group, and earlier this year I started this series of conversations to look into some of the disconnects between what we say we want from transport policy and investment and some of the outcomes that we get, and perhaps some of the system challenges that lie in the middle of those things, and talking to some people about their views on some aspects of those challenges and how we might be able to do better. If any of you have any thoughts or recommendations about people you'd like me to talk with next year, as this is the fourth and final conversation for 2021, good riddance 2021, we'll start again in 2022. Let me know. You feel free to email me or contact me if you have any thoughts for future conversants. This session is going to be recorded, and all of the conversations end up on Engineering New Zealand's YouTube channel for you to refer back to and share with your friends. So look out for the next series conversations coming up next year. Today I'm joined by Paul Brown, and I'll introduce him shortly, but I have a threefold purpose for this conversation that I didn't tell him about, but this is what it is, so I'll explain now. The first is a bit of a transport accessibility 101 from the perspective of two people who work in this area of inclusive access and transport, one of whom is blind, so that's Paul. So we have known each other for a while now, and we both like to talk about this issue. I just both like to talk, to be honest. So we will get to the guts of that. The second purpose is to understand the value of getting to know and work with disabled people when you're working in the transport sector. So to have some appreciation of why that's a good thing, why it's useful, and why it's not actually too scary and we should all do more of it. And the third purpose is to explore some tensions and opportunities at the nexus of accessible transport and climate change, because that is a topic very dear to my heart, and how therefore can we work towards an equitable, survivable future. So Paul, if you'd like to unmute yourself, I will introduce you. Paul is a policy advisor at New Zealand's Disabled Persons Assembly, based in Tamaki Makaurau. Paul is also a casual employee of MR Cagney, which is a pretty awesome sustainable transport consultancy. Paul identifies as a disabled person. He has a master's in disability studies. His interests are in disability, human rights, and inclusive engagement with disabled people. So Paul will talk shortly. Just bear in mind that you may hear some sounds come through from Paul's screen reader. Don't be alarmed, he's still there and in control.
And I don't normally talk at that speed, just I can listen very fast.
That's exactly it. So Paul, welcome. If you'd like to please tell our audience about yourself and your background, and perhaps how you've found yourself interested in transport.
Well, kia ora, ko Paul Brown aho. I'm, as Bridget said, up here in Tamaki Makaurau, although the accent is a bit of a giveaway that I don't come from here originally. So I'm originally from Dundee in Scotland, and Dundee is on the north-east coast, the east coast, but getting north, not too far north. I've been in New Zealand for Aotearoa for 11 years now, I think. Live with my partner and our 6-year-old daughter. I don't think you can be involved in disability advocacy and not get involved in transport, to be honest. The two are intrinsically linked. As long as I've been involved in the disability industry, which is getting on, well, if you count being a student at uni and active as it's 25 years plus. Transport's always been an issue. It's always been around. I think that issue, that access to transport is fundamental to work, education, participation in society and communities, all that stuff. So yeah, they go hand in hand. I don't think you can do any disability activism or advocacy without getting involved in transport.
Right, so you can't even go to a meeting without getting there, right?
Well,
So
exactly, yeah. Well, we've
comes
got
up all the
Zoom
time.
now, I guess. If we all stay home and never go out again, I mean, transport might not be an issue, but that'd be pretty dull, wouldn't it? Says he,
Yeah,
after
exactly.
100 odd days of lockdown up here.
Exactly. That absolutely comes up a lot when I'm talking
Hmm.
with disabled people, just the everyday,
Yeah.
almost boring nature of access barriers.
Oh, it's boring. I mean, I've done it before. People say, "Oh, you always seem to be talking about access issues." And I always say, "Well, actually, what? I'm bored of it. I've done it for
mm,
like, almost 40 years. I'd like to talk about someone else, get to the guts of stuff. But
yeah,
actually, it is really hard for lots of disabled people to travel and move around independently. And, you know, yeah, we are bored of it. I mean, you don't
yeah,
want every time you meet someone it to be a kind of lesson in disability access or a moan about transport.
yeah,
It'd be nice to talk about someone else sometimes.
yeah.
Although we're talking about transport today.
Yeah, well, yeah. So thanks for putting up with it
That's all right.
for this hour. In any
No
case,
probs.
yeah. Well, this is the whole point, right? Isn't it? So that having you involved can help us to undo some of these systemic challenges, or work towards that at least, so that the awareness of these issues is greater amongst people who don't have to live it every day, because the transport profession is not filled with blind people yet. We're working on
And
it.
working on it. I mean, I guess that's right. I mean, I think when you try and change any system, there's a number of ways, isn't there? I
Yeah,
mean, there's one about, throwing stones from the outside.
yeah,
And you have to do
yeah.
that sometimes.
That's
There's
right.
one about infiltrating and getting involved in it.
Yeah,
Um, and that sometimes works, although it can put a hell of a pressure on those who end up infiltrating.
yeah.
Sometimes you do. And the one I think's best is probably starting a conversation between different sectors. And so I'm very keen that the disability sector, that has lots of expertise and experience about our transport challenges, get together on kind of equal terms with the transport sector. And between us, putting those bits of knowledge together, I mean, we ought to be able to change it, really.
Well, I think so too. I'll just remind our audience, if you have any questions for Paul, please put them in the Q&A or the chat, either or, and we'll get to them a bit later on. But Paul, can you tell us, step back a bit to your master's degree, what kinds of
Oh.
issues do you end up learning about and writing about when you do a
Oh.
master's in disability policy? It sounds like something that our listeners might not
Oh,
be
well, yeah.
particularly familiar
So,
with.
I was very lucky, and I did my MA in Disability Studies uh, at the University of Leeds. And Leeds is probably the mothership
Yeah,
of disability studies in the UK. There may be some arguments around that, but so some of the most well-known academics in the disability field, people like Colin Barnes, who was my tutor, um, worked at Leeds, and Leeds had done some of the groundbreaking um, research around disability as a study. And when I
mm,
talk about disability, I'm not talking about health or illness.
yeah,
Actually, one of the first books to come out of Leeds University, their disability press, was Disability and Illness, The Great Divide.
right.
And that we could talk about that for the next hour. But
Mm,
effectively, we're talking about the social model of disability, coined by another university academic called Mike Oliver, who was at University of Greenwich, I think. But between Mike and Colin at Leeds, you were probably in the biggest. But so Mike coined this term about
the social model.
social model of disability, and that disablement, as he called it, was not by our own impairments, but caused by a society not organised for us.
Right.
And that excluded us. So it's not to say that people's individual. So it's probably worth saying that under the social model, individuals have impairment. So I have a vision impairment. I'm blind. That's my
Yeah.
impairment. I'm disabled by a society that doesn't meet that. my needs, so that it doesn't give me timetables in accessible format, that doesn't tell me at the bus stop what bus is coming, that that doesn't meet my information access and other needs. And that's not to say, as I say, that people's impairments are unimportant and don't have, you know, obviously they have an impact on how you operate in society. But it's saying that the biggest barrier is that kind of designing out, that othering, that putting disabled people somewhere else. And that's why, you know, because Mike Oliver ended up in a care home as a young man with a South African activist, a guy called Vic Finkelstein, and Vic was a wheelchair user. And Vic was effectively exiled from South Africa, this is in the 60s, for his anti-apartheid work. And Vic believed that the restrictions that he was facing as a wheelchair user were because of apartheid. And then he got to the UK, and the only place he could live was a residential care home for old people. And he couldn't go to a whole lot of places, and he actually thought, there's something not right here.
Yes.
And him and some other disabled people got together and formed the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation. It sounds quite old-fashioned now, but they really came up with, Mike Oliver coined the term, but they really came up with this, that disability was about social exclusion, and that it was, you know, a construct created, and that impairment didn't need to automatically mean you were in a rest home at, you know, age 24, or you couldn't go to places, or you were unemployed, or you were poor, but something was done to people with impairments on top of those impairments that excluded them from the kind of, effectively from participating in society.
Right, and it's not that transport engineers set out to exclude people, it's just an industry kind of habit. I had a dream once that I could fly, and it was awesome.
Okay,
and then I woke up and I thought, well, I can't fly, that's a bugger. The world is designed for a certain assumption, isn't it, about how people can get around, and not just the physical world, but like you say, the information.
All of it.
And most of the people involved in that design, especially historically, before even, you know, people of my gender were allowed to work as engineers, it was designed for and by people who knew no better, because people like you were locked away, weren't they? There was this implicit and quite often explicit assumption about who should be out and about. And now in 2021, we have quite a rapidly increasing expectation by a lot of disabled people that they should be able to live their lives, which is not reasonable. So we're increasingly finding ourselves needing to go back and fix you know, problems that were built in literally to our streets over the last decades and centuries in some cases. So here we are.
If we want to do a bit of theory about it, or a bit of, you know, the policy kind of context, I mean, New Zealand was the first country in the world, I believe, to have a disability strategy in 2001, and it set up some obligations on government to make New Zealand more accessible and to deal with some of the barriers. Then we signed the UN Disability Convention in 2008, and that has international obligations. It doesn't have a specific article on transport, by the way, which is quite interesting, but it has articles on, you know, things like
the rights to participate,
the right to participate in leisure and social life, the right to live in the community independently, the right to mobility. It has a big article around ability and access. So it does cover transport, although I think it's quite interesting that it isn't explicitly there. And if I were rewriting the convention, it is something that, if it ever happens, I would want to push for a specific article on transport. You've got these things going on, and the disability strategy being refreshed. One of the key things that the convention says is that disabled people's organisations, representative organisations, so like DPA and others, have to be not just consulted but involved in decisions about us.
Well, they
And
say these things, Paul.
it's getting better.
This is kind of why this conversation series is going on. We say a lot of things.
Yeah.
How do we know? And so when people move from South Africa to the UK and find actually that it's not necessarily, is there a place in the world that is measuring its success any better than us? Because how do we know whether we've done any good?
These things are all arguable, aren't they? I mean, Norway, for example, has a target to become, to embrace universal design, I think, by 2025. So, certainly the Scandinavian countries appear to be doing quite well, but then, I don't know, I sent you an article recently written by a Scandinavian guy who was talking about some of the issues he faced, and so, it's not easy. America has had a Disability Discrimination Act for for a long time, and the numbers of disabled people unemployed in the States has barely changed. Some places have parliamentarians that you have to have someone who's disabled in Parliament. I don't know whether that will ultimately make a change or not.
Right.
It's certainly got to be, I think it's got to be worth a go, given that other things aren't changing it a lot. And most people find parliaments have someone like them in them. As far as I'm aware, the current Parliament has one MP now who has come out as a disabled person.
Yeah. So we rely on these kinds of indirect measures of how far we're getting. In transport, it's difficult because we know that the Ministry of Transport's Household Travel Survey has only recently asked its participants whether they identify as disabled, and that's only at a person level, not a street level. So,
well, along with the huge issue around transport, Bridget, you've walked into a huge issue about the paucity, the lack of disaggregated information about disabled people. And so the main way of collecting that was, it used to be every 5 years, now they made it every 10, to have a disability survey that came out of the census. And in terms of overall numbers and, some of that big planning stuff, that was probably relatively helpful, but, only so far. And so they've started having disability, and we could argue about whether they've got it quite right, or, and I think you could have a whole programme on that probably, but we are starting to get disability being measured in other surveys. But you're right, until we get a number of years of it, comparisons and being able to track how well we're doing, progress being made, is still not quite there yet.
Yeah, so what I'd like to, just for people who aren't aware, I've been had an interest in this area for a few years now, and one of the things I'd like to see is some maps of where in Auckland do blind people prefer to walk, for example, because that would be hugely insightful to go back and then measure the characteristics of those streets to find out how to make other streets more inclusive. So, Paul, is there a street in Auckland, like when you walk somewhere, do you go the most direct route, traffic be damned, or are there things about that you favourite routes? What are the characteristics of a favourite walking route?
I think it's really interesting because you did fire me some questions beforehand, and that was one you asked. And it's a bit like people say, "Give me an accessible website," and it's really hard, because actually these things are all specific, and you go to different websites to do different things, and if your doctor's across a really busy road, no matter what you do, you've got to cross that road to get to your doctor's, or to the supermarket or whatever. So I think for me, places with wide pavements, I do like. One of the reasons that I live in Mangere Bridge, and one of the reasons we chose Mangere Bridge is it's a suburb that still has quite a few berms in most streets, and that's quite cool to know that there's a decent separation between you and the road. And so, when we were looking at houses, we specifically, one of our, criterion, one of the checklists, if you like, we had was, is there a berm? Is it, safe when you come out your drive,
Does that make you, does that affect how safe you feel as well as, you know, like actually are? Are you likely to wander?
I think I can. Yeah, I don't. I do walk. I can go a bit squint, particularly if I'm not paying attention. So yep.
Can't
So
we all? Yep.
yeah, even when I'm sober, it gives me a buffer. You know, it gives you a bit of margin to go wrong. which which is good, but it certainly makes you feel safer.
Yeah, sure.
Controlled crossings, I think, are better than non-controlled crossings.
So zebra crossings and traffic lights?
Zebras and traffic lights, yeah. I don't like these, you know, I really don't like these ones with refuges, they call them for some reason, in the middle, you know, where it's not clear about who has right of way, and you're standing in the middle and you're trying to work out whether, you know, the north or south or east or west side is where the traffic is, and, you know, you can stand there all day. So I don't like these non-controlled crossings. I think crossings that give certainty are the most useful, and zebras give certainty that pedestrians have right of way, and even better is a controlled
traffic lights. That's your favourite?
Would be favourite, absolutely. Being visible at routes is important, and so, you know, sometimes you need someone else to do that. But my partner, you know, there's a couple of places even on our street where my partner said, look, don't cross there, you know, cross further up or lower down, because you're not terribly visible to oncoming traffic, you know.
So this is something I didn't ask you about, but so your daughter is 6 years old now, and are you finding, like, if you're out walking with her, would you go out for a walk with her? Is there a kind of, some parts of that walking route that you would decide, in some parts is she increasingly helpful, you know?
Yes, she is. Yeah, she's pretty good. But yes, I mean, I'm still the adult, so I'll make the ultimate decision. But yeah, I mean, she will say, she quite often tells me to duck, and we make a joke about me quacking if there's overhanging trees, and, you know, she's pretty good, and she will say there's things, you know, there's a problem here, or there's road work.
Well, she's probably more aware of road safety than an average 6-year-old.
I think that's right. Yes.
But we talk also in transport about child-friendly design, and particularly traffic volumes and speeds. I think parents, you know, quite sensitive to that. And you think there's a bit of overlap? You know, we talk universal design. I
think there's quite a lot of overlap, actually. I think, you know, slower traffic, you know,
obvious crossings,
less traffic, obvious crossings, you know, all the so I do, and in the same way, you know, Auckland is now a so-called age-friendly city.
So is Hamilton, apparently.
Work out what that means ultimately, but I think there's overlap. There's overlap there too.
So that talks to one of the questions I had, which was about, is there any tension between different disability advocacy groups, or do you think we genuinely, most of the time, can get a universally inclusive outcome if we all work together?
Yeah, I think it depends who you talk to and quite what it's about. So I'll plug for DPA. We are the only pan-impairment disabled persons organisation in New Zealand. The others are all, their membership is made up of people with particular impairments. So Association of Blind Citizens, which I'm also a member of, Kapo Maori, which is a blindness organisation, Deaf Aotearoa, you know, so People First for people with learning disabilities, and so on. And they all work together now through a coalition, the Disabled Persons Organisations Coalition. And so that has helped, actually. There's less of the kind of, you know...
How long's the DPO been going?
The DPO coalition...
coalition.
The coalition's been going for... going back... Getting on for 10 years, the Disabled Persons Coalition, the coalition's been going. DPA, I think, goes back to the Year of Disabled People in 1981.
Right.
So DPA goes back. The oldest, we think, is Blind Citizens, which has just celebrated its 75th anniversary. Well, it came out, of course, lots of blind people together at Parnell from school, and then in blind workshops, and the blindness organisations like to have a good lifelong grip of their clients, of blind people.
Oh.
I mean, it's until the 1970s, by the way, blind people, you had to ask the Blind Foundation for permission to marry.
Is that a fact?
Yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, we're talking disabled people having their lives quite controlled.
Gosh, it's been
by
quite a shift.
organisations. Yeah, there's a shift. There's no doubt. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
deinstitution. When we talked about the policy settings, one of the things we didn't talk about was kind of deinstitutionalisation. We don't have, thank God, Lake Alice and Kimberley and these other places. Now, there's arguments, of course, about whether we've got it right and what we do have, and I'm sure we haven't, and there's still
Always learning,
There's always learning. But so deinstitutionalisation. But yeah, I mean, these organisations had, a huge impact on the life of disabled people. I mean, I was at a blind school in Edinburgh, and that blind school had in my day, it was the only thing there was a school, but it had been. Oh no, it's not true. Sorry, it was a school and then an old folks' home for older blind people. They had a nursery for kids, and they had kind of workshops and stuff at one point. And they had a braille. Actually, no, they didn't. They had an employment, but they had a kind of braille press for printing braille books. So mostly blind people who worked there. So these organisations had quite a big
role,
reach,
really.
and quite a big role in the lives of many disabled people.
And I think, do you think perhaps there's a legacy of, there's a difference between advocacy and activism, but there is also, when we talked about boredom dealing with transport, there's a lot of frustration about having to argue for basic human rights, and that perhaps has a history as well. And in terms of, we're not completely inclusive society, people get quite feisty about that sometimes, which is fair enough.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think I try not to blame individual people I deal with for stuff. But we all have bad hair days, right? So sometimes I get it wrong, and the fifth person who's offered to help me on a route where I know where I'm going, kind of I get a bit fed up and go, leave me alone. But I try and be different towards individuals and institutions, if you like.
Sure.
And I think, but we all have
play the ball, not the player. Yeah.
That's right. We all have days, don't we?
Yeah. So, when we think about climate change, and I've had a couple of conversations in this series about that, and there's obviously a big momentum around climate change policy in all sorts of sectors, including transport. Do you think there are any challenges towards a just transition? There's talk of a just transition and an equity lens and blah, blah, blah. What comes to mind for you when you think about that?
A number of things depending on. So it's not all about me, but if we start with me and my impairment, I don't drive, you'll be pleased to hear. Although one day, and I know we disagree on this one day I do think I'll have my driverless car. But I know you're not convinced by that. Just stay out the road and you'll be fine. So I don't drive. So just because public transport is greener or low emitting, won't make it any more accessible. So we still have to plan that. It won't make getting to it necessarily any easier if the pavements are still, a problem, and if there's still roadworks in the way, and if there's no controlled crossings, and you're still taking your life in your hands. It won't make the information, the timetables and all that stuff automatically easier. So we have to think about it. It also creates some challenges in itself. So e-buses, e-vehicles tend to be quieter, and we don't yet have a fully agreed international standard about the type of noise or a minimum level of noise. We have an EU standard in Europe, and we have other standards in different US states and stuff, and a bit of work we're doing, we're starting to look at it very early doors in Aotearoa, but there isn't a standard, but we know they're quieter, and we know that there needs to be a standard. also in terms of cars, for example, e-cars tend to be smaller, so therefore issues about disabled people who need to do like store wheelchairs and so on. The infrastructure of electric vehicles being accessible. It's no good if you're a wheelchair user and can't plug your electric car in somewhere, because that's inaccessible. But one of the moves also to low emissions is to keep, to make it difficult for drivers to go certain places.
Right,
and that creates some real tensions for wheelchair users often, and people with mobility difficulties, but also for people like myself who don't have difficulties walking, but can't just get dropped off somewhere while somebody else goes to find a park and say, let's meet at the bandstand at blah, in 10 minutes, and so it does create issues, and so there is a tension. So there are a few tensions, I think, and challenges.
Just hone in on that one. So there is there are a range of views from transport and climate change advocates towards cars and the private car, and there are increasingly councils with policies around fossil-free city centres and so-called access for everyone, and policies which never really intended to exclude people, but like what you're saying is that there is a risk that we don't consider, and there's also a justified concern, because the needs of disabled people haven't always been explicitly considered. In fact, that's a very generous way to frame it. So what can we do then to help with that narrative? Because there are some people in the transport sector who are at the end of the spectrum and would say, I'd like to ban cars. And then there are others of us who are pro-sustainable transport would say, well, actually, we're not saying ban cars, but aside from working with disability sector groups, what are some of the things we can do to
so I think there's a few things. I mean, I certainly don't want to set it up as some kind of battle between walkers and cyclists, or transport planners and disabled people, or car users versus non-car users. I don't think that gets us very far. So I think
not when they're banned anyway.
No, not when they're banned anyway. So I think if you're using, so one of the things that you've got to have accessible transport to your kind of city centres that have less cars in them. So there has to be an option for disabled people to get there, I think.
Well, and those options, so getting quite specific then. So say we're going to have a, promote, like reduce car access to Auckland Central. That policy itself needs to, for an equality response, to actually increase the effort to make the other modes accessible, not just to say that there are other modes there, but
to make them accessible, to show how they're accessible, exactly, for them to be really accessible. I think you also need to have more kind of drop-off and pick-up points.
Well, in general, right? Like with Uber and everything.
Yes, and for disabled people particularly. But yes, there's, for many disabled people like myself, if there's just a drop-off point, I can be dropped there or picked up there. Some people do need, low
mobility parking.
Mobility parking, but, so there needs to be more of that. So I think if you're getting rid of parking spaces and making streets largely car-free, you do need to think about pick up and drop off points. I think so.
So recommend more research.
Absolutely.
Mobility parking is a big interest of mine, because we don't have any good data about it, who the demand for it. The demand is growing with aging population. CCS Disability Action maintain the database of mobility parking permit holders, and I've been working with them on some stuff, and it turns out that 70% of those permit holders are over the age of 70. So it's a really, really old
and there are
population.
About 70,000 or something on that data.
Yeah, there are a lot. Right? And in some districts in New Zealand, based on their age structure, that's going to grow by 50% just in the next sort of 8 years.
So back to your question about Auckland, and let's talk about something, and let's not pretend that we're not kind of involved in it in different ways. But there's just been a consultation, and Auckland Council has come back to the Auckland branch of the Association of Blind Citizens to discuss with us the move towards basically getting cars off of Queen Street in Auckland,
Yep.
which is one part of it, so having just buses. And the other part is having a path shared by wheeled but non-motorised. They keep calling it a shared path. And
they're calling it a multi-use path
multi-use
to avoid
path.
calling it a cycleway because electric scooters can't legally use a cycleway. So let's just back up a bit and say that the cross section of Queen Street, they're talking about changing it from it is now where there's a footpath and traffic lanes and parking to more of a transit mall where it is buses, bicycles, all sorts of other devices and pedestrians.
People,
And one of the main challenges with that design is what do you do with the cyclists and electric scooter users at the bus stops?
So the current position is to have nearest the building to have a path which isn't mandated to be, but is largely for people walking. And then you have this shared wheeled path, so scooters, bikes and so on. Then you go across that path to the road and bus stops. And going across it towards the road is probably difficult because you can't make things stop. I really worry about people getting off the bus and being slightly disorientated and kind of working their, exactly where they are and finding out once they've got their bearings, they're standing in the middle of a wheeled area.
So I think this is interesting to talk about because I think it's one of the most challenging topics I've ever had to work on. I've worked on this in different projects, and they're called cycleway bus stop bypasses, where essentially a cycleway goes behind a bus stop adjacent to or takes over a section of the footpath for that length while the bus stop is there, and it's to avoid cyclists needing to use a traffic lane or to wait for the bus. So there's a whole lot of it's nobody would say that is an easy thing to resolve. But what you're saying, Paul, is that the biggest challenge, and perhaps something for the audience to consider, is that specific point where somebody's getting off the bus, say a blind person
getting off the bus or midpoint crossings. I think both of these are difficult.
So getting off the bus where you're scanning off and worrying about where you are. And then, there's videos online of someone getting swiped at that point where they get off the bus by an e-scooter. And so the challenge here is not even necessarily the objective crash risk, because arguably the actual risk is low, blah, blah. But what that experience does to somebody who is blind, it's likely to put them off using.
Well, you wouldn't do it twice, would you? You wouldn't put yourself in the firing line again, really.
No, and I've had feedback from people say, they've even heard from someone else that it's scary and therefore not used it. So the challenge from my mind is that we create these public places, and for all intents and purposes, according to how we measure success, they look fine. And I've heard that say, it works fine. Yeah, it works fine because the most vulnerable people avoid it. And that's the challenge we have in transport.
Well, I think that was the point I made to Auckland Council when we were talking to them last week. Exactly that. That no one is suggesting that they're designing blind and disabled people out.
Not intentionally.
Not intentionally, but that's what will happen. Blind people will say, Queen Street's hellish. You get off the bus and you have to cross this cycle lane and you have to cross past these e-scooters. And people remember what, as someone who until recently worked in the city centre and walked down Queen Street every day from the Civic down to Shortland Street, if people know the area. My dices with e-scooters, were amazing. Either left lying about to trip over, people leaving them just by traffic light poles, people whizzing past you. It's quite scary when you can't see what's happening. You're just walking along and this thing goes right at, quieter than that even, right at your ear, I certainly was involved in a bit of campaigning and research that the Blind Foundation did a radio interview thing as well around it. You know, it was, I reckon, most days for around 6 or 8 months I had an encounter of some kind with an e-scooter.
We'd probably call it a near miss or a hit.
Or a hit, yeah.
So the ways around that, then we'll wrap this bit up. We've got a couple of questions, but the ways around that are early engagement, would you say? So, more research in terms of, because I'd quite like to get this stuff much more objective and out in the open. Who is displaced and who isn't there? But for a specific project, early engagement with disability.
Let's talk about one thing I think that does it quite well, where Auckland has done really well, which are the city centre shared spaces.
Yep.
Which
is unusual internationally.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
but
good on you,
Auckland got disabled people involved very early and created the shared space in Fort Street and Elliott Street and the others that people know about. And so they made one bit of it, walking only.
The accessible route, they call it.
The accessible route. They delineated it between the other bit of the route, although you could use it, but they slowed cars down. But effectively they created a shared path where there was still a pavement.
Yep.
And it's pretty good,
Yeah.
Yes, of course, coming at it for the first time, you need to learn it a bit, and but actually they work really pretty well, and that was because they engaged with disabled people really early, because they knew from
that it was contentious
internationally. It was contentious.
That's great. So I've put a link in the chat to disability sector engagement guide that I wrote a while ago, which has links to all of these organisations and helps people work out what kind of engagement to do and when and things. We had a couple of questions, and they're both kind of COVID related. I'll start with the second one, because it said, has the Auckland lockdown made transport easier for blind people and others with disabilities? And Paul and I have both been involved in some research for Waka Kotahi that said no. In general terms, disabled people report more transport challenges in lockdown than other people. But I'll let you answer that, Paul. Has there been anything about the lockdown that's made transport easier for you?
Transport, no. Walking, probably. So I can't tell that I'm 2 metres apart, but assuming that other people want to stay out what my 6-year-old has been taught at school is the moist breath zone, horrible, then I work on the basis that most people
word moist.
want to stay away from me and not get COVID. So that aside, I mean, streets are quieter, roads are less busy, in the suburbs particularly. So going out for a walk in some ways is probably more pleasant. If we've been out as a family and my wee one's taken her bike or scooter, we can go to car parks of buildings that are closed and she can zoom about, and I don't, because I find car parks pretty scary. We've talked about that before. That I don't take shortcuts through car parks. You never know.
Yeah, a lot of blind people do.
Cars with idling engines are doing.
There's no obvious route off.
And who's watching when they come out of parking spaces and so on. So that's been quite cool. In terms of what's happened in Auckland with the buses, so Auckland basically initially set up a situation where people had to come on to the back of the bus, and they said that disabled people could come on the front and ask the driver, but I think as a wheelchair user you would end up having to cut the tape, because most places put tape across, and you couldn't get through it. As a blind person as well, I mean, you don't know where people are sitting on the bus, and in normal circumstances I have almost sat on people. Usually they yell and everybody's a wee bit embarrassed or makes a laugh and you just get over it. But in COVID times, that's certainly more difficult. Now the tape has been moved, and so a person who needs the wheelchair area seating could get in there, but if you don't need the wheelchair seating as a blind person, you still have to kind of get on the back. And I don't know if the driver's watching that properly. It's just all quite difficult, actually. Also, some of the streets in Auckland changed quite a bit in the centre. They kind of extended them a bit, which again kept you away from traffic, but routes you kind of knew became just that wee bit more difficult, because these changes kind of happened overnight extending the pavement, the sidewalks and Queen Street and so on. So
kind of related to roadworks, which we won't go into for
yeah.
time reasons, but
and I think lots of disabled people, okay, you could still, for a time, taxis were free and that was great. Particularly when
with the mobility,
with total mobility, yes, effectively
yeah.
they were free if you were a total mobility card holder, and that was great. Except when Delta came and spread around, do you really want to jump in a taxi if you can help it?
So there's kind of layers of anxiety on top of the normal challenges.
I think that's right.
And what about there's a question about COVID testing being drive-through, and does that present challenges?
No, well, that's been a biggie. That's been raised a lot, actually. So it's getting better now that GPs and stuff started to come on board. But you're right. So I've known people who have gone for not the testing, vaccination, and had to organise taxis and get folk to meet them, and it's been a bit of a hassle in terms of.
Is that because of the drive-through vaccination, or
is it because of the drive-through? They're not allowed to walk partly,
up.
Wow. And then the testing too. I mean, if you don't have. My partner drives, so we're quite lucky, but in that sense. But if you don't have a driver, is a taxi going to do that? I mean, sit there with you while you get tested and stuff.
Well, it'd be expensive.
Expensive and so on. And so, no, I think that vaccination's been difficult for lots of disabled people. At DPA, we've heard from people who say, for example, just sitting in the car for a long time like that makes you quite sore. What if you need to go to the loo? Are there accessible toilets? So no, so that's been an issue actually. Now that pharmacies and GPs and stuff are doing testing and vaccine, it's made things a bit easier, and there has been some moves to organise transport for disabled people for testing and for vaccines, but it started off quite difficultly, I think, and I think a number of disabled people from the survey work we did, Bridget, made it quite clear that they probably times should have gone for tests and didn't, and so on.
There was certainly a narrative in the transport sector that lockdown was good for transport because people were claiming the streets and walking and biking was a lot more pleasant, and people were rediscovering the bikes in their garage, and as a human person, a disabled person appreciates all of that stuff.
Absolutely,
But there are these other and as is often the case, these hidden challenges that we don't hear about that make everyday life.
And we have had some difficult. Kind of ignorance type stuff, haven't we? We've been aware of disabled people being told, travelling by train, it's only meant to be for work, and people going to get food for their assistance dogs and stuff. So some issues about what actually is essential travel and let's call them misunderstandings. That might be charitable, but but certainly some miscommunications about that. So there's been a human factor that hasn't always been helpful either.
Absolutely. So there's a third question here which you may have thought about recently. Do you think the electric car without noise can affect some people with disability?
Yes.
So
is the answer.
Paul and I are working on a research project for Waka Kotahi about electric buses and the impact of them being less noisy, specifically on for all sorts of reasons. But
there's even things that, I got a taxi the other week and I said to my partner, the taxi's not here, and she said, yes, it is, he's sitting in the drive, it's an electric, it's a hybrid, so, it was always a good, it probably wasn't good for the environment, but it was always quite helpful, particularly for taxi drivers don't get out and show you to the car, at least you knew where the car was and often which way it was facing by the sound of the engine. So that's minor. But that's one. But yes, the as I say, there are a few issues with electric cars. One is the sound, and that needs to be looked at in New Zealand. The other, as I say, for disabled people who drive or use them, is the size, and that can you store wheelchairs and stuff. And the other is the accessibility of the infrastructure
and charging things,
and then charge it, and But
so have you noticed? any noise impacts in terms of just the way that you use noise to cross the street, for example? Are you more wary
Yes,
nowadays, like knowing there's more
yes,
electric cars
yes.
around?
It's quite interesting because there's more to. So I've been blind since birth, and so um, I don't know when I learned to know about cars coming and moving and stuff, but there's more to it than just the engine noise.
Yeah,
There's the tyre sound on the road. It's more difficult if it's a wet day to quite work out the distances by the sound.
right.
There are weather factors in there, and I'm not quite sure. Some scientists would probably be able to tell me what the science was behind that. But,
Yeah,
there definitely are issues given, and some streets are more difficult, sound bounces around and so on, or just noisier streets than others.
yeah.
So there's all that goes on anyway. But, um,
Well, it goes back to what you said earlier about your preferences for a traffic light crossing or a zebra crossing.
preference is a traffic light or zebra crossing because I know when I'm meant to be able to cross. I mean, you've
Yeah,
always got the odd fool who goes through, but
yeah,
generally speaking,
yeah,
it's much safer. But I think you're right. I do take a bit more time and I'm a bit more careful now because I'm aware that on the road I've got electric vehicles that I might not hear, and on the pavement I've got electric e-scooters that I might not hear. You know.
yeah.
And I mean, I've never actually been hit by one, but I have tripped over them and found them around. And, I mean, certainly the Lime scooters in Auckland, they had a bit of weight in them.
Yeah, for
You
sure.
know,
Yeah, and some of
that
those
battery's heavy.
companies are getting clever about requiring the scooter user to take a photo of their scooter, and they have AI, artificial intelligence to or machine learning, I suppose, to know whether they've parked it properly, and they're
Mm.
not, and they keep getting charged until they've sent that photo. So that's there's
Yep,
ways,
that's great. Yep.
yeah, yeah.
But
So,
I wouldn't like what I'm saying is I wouldn't like to be hit by one going at speed.
well, no,
They've got a bit of weight behind them and a bit of force if they're moving, and so yeah, no, I think it has in some ways got more difficult, and there is more traffic. Sound like
yeah,
an old
yeah,
fart, but there is more traffic than there used to be. It's kind of
yeah.
although some places are trying quite hard in the burbs to kind of some traffic calming measures, but it's
Do
and
you
we've
think
just got a whole lot of crossings in Mangere Bridge, which a whole lot of zebras now,
raised
which
zebra
has made
crossings? Yeah,
raised zebras, which has made life loads easier.
bit of a plug
Not
for raised zebras. We like them.
yeah. Raised zebras are good. So they're not
Yeah,
always good as they should be. There are some wee issues around some of them,
yeah,
but it has made quite a difference to getting around the area.
yeah, sure.
Yeah,
So, do you think, can we be positive about the future? I'm not. I mean, we're in New Zealand. We're a small country.
yeah,
We can have conversations like this. We can all share and try
yeah,
and get on with each other. Do you think there's a collaborative approach to solving
yeah.
some of these climate change challenges, especially in New Zealand,
I
where we
guess
shouldn't have,
if you expect me to be a Pollyanna, I'm not going to do that
no,
because
I'd be a fool.
I think there are issues. But
Yeah,
I thought Scotland was a place where you knew everyone till I came to New Zealand. So one of the beauties that we have is it's not difficult to find someone who knows someone to get to the ear of someone.
yeah,
Doesn't always help, but you can. I think we are a small. Country and can collaborate in ways that other places might struggle.
yeah,
Often, where you've got multi-agencies in other countries, you have agencies here that control a whole lot of stuff centrally maybe as
sure,
opposed to local authorities. So I think there are some real advantages. I think people here are quite concerned about the climate and want to do something about that. So I'm hoping that we can get together. We had in the run up to the last election at DPA, we had did a bit of work with a number of environmental organisations who
right,
kind of fought our corner, the disability corner, a bit about shovel-ready projects being accessible and thinking about some of this. So there's already a bit of a move. There's also a couple of climate change organisations that that are really thinking about disability and looking at that tension between. We submitted to the Climate Change Commission's report and got
sure,
some quite good stuff in there. I mean, just in the last week, yesterday, in fact, I put in DPA's submission on the low emissions plan, and we're working on the waste one now. So there's quite a lot going on, and I think we're just arguing that actually, I mean, disabled people have huge issues around climate change, right? I mean,
Sure.
lots of disabled people, particularly people with mobility issues, tend to live in low-lying flat areas for obvious reasons.
Yep.
So chance their house is going to be washed away. So it's a huge issue. Disabled people are probably most at risk around climate change on a kind of world basis, and in some ways the least likely to, the least able to respond to that. So there's a lot to win around disabled people and people who would be seen as more traditionally kind of climate change people coming together.
Sure.
It doesn't mean there aren't some challenges, but I don't think it should be difficult to agree a noise that comes out of an electric car, the type and level of the noise, and to stop it being turned off. It shouldn't be difficult to say when we buy e-buses that they need to be accessible for wheelchair users. It shouldn't be difficult to say the trains that we get, we make them accessible. And so, and that we have drop-off places in our city centres, some specifically for people who need mobility parking, and just others that can be used. I think we can do a lot of this if we get together and talk to each other.
Well, that's perfect. We've just about out of time, but I think, do you think that would be a good takeaway for an engineer or transport planner listening in to talk to disabled people, to make friends with them, to go and buy them a coffee and find out more, because we're all in this
I respond
together.
to whiskey more than coffee, but I mean, coffee's a start.
Yeah, sometimes evidence of that. So make friends with each other a bit more, and so that we can work together more easily, because it's much easier to do that when you have shared a whiskey, isn't it?
I think so. And also think about disabled, the organisations of disabled people, the representative organisations, and they know where disabled people are. And I think, I think it depends on the level of consultation. So if you've got a big consultation, then you should be talking to disabled people's organisations and doing that. If it's a street-wide thing, then knock on doors in the street and try and find out the people who aren't normally counted.
That's
some
great.
of those will be disabled people, won't they?
That's right. That's exactly what I've said in the guide that I put in the chat. So that's very handy. You endorse that. So I think we'll leave it there now. I'd like to thank you very much, Paul. That was awesome. We might even do another session like this next year with some other people, because I obviously find it very interesting and useful. So
and there certainly are lots of disabled people who are interested in transport. I mean, maybe one of the things that you might like to talk about next year is when the Okatahi research comes out.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, everybody can stay tuned for that. So that research project is called Disabled People's Experiences of Transport. We had the Disabled Persons Assembly as paid sub-consultants in that research, and it's got a lot of insights and recommendations about what we can all do to make transport more inclusive and accessible. So thanks very much, Paul. Thanks Engineering New Zealand for hosting us. This recording will, as I said, go on YouTube, so we'll share that with you all. I hope you all have a good day, and we'll see you all next time. Thanks very much.
Cheers, ka kite.
Thanks, Paul.